They called her a gold digger. They whispered that she trapped a billionaire with a pregnancy just to secure a fortune. And when Julian Kensington died, his family didn't just want Madeline out. They wanted her destroyed. At the will reading, the room was filled with sharks smiling as the lawyer read Julian's final cruel words. He left his pregnant wife absolutely nothing, or so they thought. But they forgot one tiny legal detail buried in the paperwork, a detail that wouldn't just give Madeline the money, but would hand her the power to destroy them all. You won't believe what was in the envelope. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to wash the sins off the pavement of the Kensington estate, and failing miserably. It was a cold, gray Tuesday, the day Julian Kensington, tech mogul, philanthropist, and covert narcissist, was laid to rest. Madeline stood by the open grave, her heels sinking slightly into the wet, manicured grass. She was 8 months pregnant. Her ankles were swollen. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and the black Givenchy coat she wore a gift from Julian during one of his apology phases felt like a suffocating blanket. She didn't cry. That was the first thing the tabloids would note. The widow wore dry eyes. But how could she cry for a man who had spent the last year making her feel like an intruder in her own marriage? Julian had been charming, magnetic, and brilliant when they met. He was the heir to Kensington Dynamics, a logistics empire worth billions. She was Madeline Carter, a scholarship student finishing her architecture degree. It was a whirlwind romance that the press ate up. Cinderella meets the prince. But the prince had a darkness. "Look at her," a voice hissed behind her. It was sharp, distinct, and intentionally loud enough to be heard over the priest's drone. Madeline didn't need to turn around to know it was Beatrice Kensington, Julian's mother. Beatrice was a woman who wore pearls like armor and viewed empathy as a poverty trait. "She's barely showing any emotion," another voice joined in. This one was younger, sultrier, Vanessa Roach, Julian's executive assistant, and the woman who had been at Julian's side in Paris when he had the heart attack while Madeline sat at home knitting baby booties. "She's probably calculating the settlement in her head right now." Madeline placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick. "Just hold on," she told herself. "Just get through today." The funeral was a spectacle. Senators' rival CEOs and Hollywood elites crowded the cemetery. They offered Madeline limp handshakes and hollow condolences, their eyes darting to her stomach, then to Beatrice, gauging where the power would shift. After the coffin was lowered, the procession moved back to the main house, a sprawling, cold, modern fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Sound. The staff, led by the butler Higgins, moved silently, offering champagne and caviar. It felt less like a wake and more like a networking event. Madeline retreated to the library, needing a moment of silence. She sat in Julian's heavy leather chair, the smell of his expensive cologne, sandalwood, and tobacco still lingering in the leather. It made her nauseous. The door creaked open. Beatrice walked in, followed closely by Vanessa. "You shouldn't get too comfortable in that chair, Madeline," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with faux politeness. She took a sip of her martini. "Changes are coming. Rapid ones." Madeline looked up, exhaustion etched into her pale features. "My husband was buried an hour ago, Beatrice. Can we not do this today?" "Julian is gone," Vanessa said, stepping forward. She wore a black dress that was cut a little too low, a little too tight for a funeral. "And let's be honest, sweetie, the only reason he kept you around this long was because of the inconvenience." She gestured dismissively at Madeline's stomach. "This is my child," Madeline said, her voice trembling with a mix of hormones and rage. "Julian's child." Beatrice laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "We'll see what the DNA test says, won't we? But regardless, Julian was a practical man. He knew he made a mistake marrying a barista with a pretty face. He was planning to file for divorce the week he got back from Paris. Did you know that... Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. She knew things were bad. She knew they slept in separate rooms. But divorce? He didn't, Madeline whispered. He did. Vanessa smirked, pulling a phone from her clutch. He drafted the text to his lawyer. I saw it. He wanted you out, Madeline. He wanted to start over, with someone who understood his world. Ladies, a deep baritone voice boomed from the doorway. They all turned. Standing there was Geoffrey Pendergast, the senior partner at Cromwell & Sullivan and Julian's personal attorney for 20 years. He was a large man with silver hair and a face made of granite. He held a thick leather briefcase. Mr. Pendergast. Beatrice smiled, her demeanor shifting instantly to that of a grieving mother. We were just comforting poor Madeline. I'm sure, Pendergast said, his tone unreadable. However, the schedule is tight. Julian's instructions were explicit. The will reading is to happen immediately following the reception. In the grand study, 30 minutes. Is that necessary? Madeline asked, struggling to stand up. Can't it wait until tomorrow? Pendergast looked at her. For a second, Madeline thought she saw a flicker of pity in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. I'm afraid not, Mrs. Kensington. Julian was adamant. Everyone must be present, including you. Beatrice downed the rest of her drink. Well then, she said, her eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. Let's get it over with. I need to know how soon we can fumigate this house. The grand study was a room designed to intimidate. The walls were lined with first-edition books that had never been read, and the center was dominated by a massive mahogany table. Madeline took a seat at the far end. On the opposite side sat Beatrice and Julian's younger brother Frederick, a man who had failed at 3 startups funded by Julian and had a gambling problem he barely hid. Next to them sat Vanessa, looking less like an employee and more like the widow. Pendergast sat at the head of the table. He placed the briefcase down and clicked the gold latches open. The sound echoed like gunshots in the silent room. Before we begin, Pendergast said, arranging a stack of documents, I must inform you that this session is being recorded per the instructions of the deceased. Just get on with it, Geoffrey, Frederick grumbled, tapping his fingers on the table. We all know the drill. Beatrice gets the trust, I get the liquidity, and the girl gets a payoff to leave quietly. Frederick, hush, Beatrice snapped, though she looked confident. Pendergast cleared his throat. Julian Kensington's estate is valued at approximately $4.2 billion, including assets, real estate, and majority holdings in Kensington Dynamics. The number hung in the air. $4 billion. It was an unfathomable amount of money. First, Pendergast began reading from a thick, cream-colored paper. To my brother Frederick, I leave the sum of $5 million. Frederick slammed his hand on the table. 5, that's it. I have debts. Geoffrey, $5 million is an insult. Pendergast didn't look up. And, he continued, I leave you the ownership of the Clean Slate Rehab Center in Arizona with tuition paid in full for a 6-month stay. Acceptance of the cash is conditional upon completion of the program. Vanessa stifled a laugh. Frederick turned red, sinking back into his chair, muttering curses. To my mother Beatrice, Pendergast continued, I leave the Kensington Ancestral Home in London, the collection of vintage Rolls-Royces and a monthly stipend of $50,000 for the remainder of her life. Beatrice frowned. Stipend, I don't want an allowance, Geoffrey. I want my shares in the company. I sat on the board for 10 years. The will is specific, Beatrice, Pendergast said coolly. Julian felt that at your age the stress of management was unwise. Madeline watched them. They were tearing each other apart over millions, while she sat there wondering if she'd have a roof over her head for her baby. She didn't care about the billions. She just wanted safety. She wanted to leave this toxic pit of vipers. "And now," Pendergast said, shifting the papers, "to Vanessa Roach." Vanessa straightened her posture, shooting a smug look at Madeline. "To Vanessa, my loyal assistant," Pendergast read, "I leave the penthouse apartment in Manhattan, the villa in Saint-Tropez, and a lump sum of $10 million. Vanessa gasped, a theatrical hand flying to her chest. "Oh, Julian, he loved me. He really loved me." Beatrice looked ready to strangle Vanessa. "This is absurd. She was a secretary." "She was his comfort," Pendergast said flatly. He then looked toward the end of the table. "And finally, to my wife, Madeline Kensington." The room went deathly silent. The rain lashed against the windows. Madeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She instinctively wrapped her arms around her belly. Pendergast didn't read from the paper this time. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a small black remote control. "Julian wished to deliver this message himself," Pendergast said. He pointed the remote at the large flat-screen TV, mounted above the fireplace. The screen flickered to life. The image on the screen was high definition. It showed Julian sitting in this very room perhaps only a month ago. He looked thinner, his skin sallow, but his eyes were sharp, burning with a manic intensity. He was holding a glass of whiskey. "Hello, everyone," the digital Julian said. His voice filled the room ghostly and commanding. Madeline flinched. It was like he was there. "If you're watching this, I'm dead," Julian said with a dark chuckle. "Good. I was tired anyway." He took a sip of whiskey. "I've dealt with the leeches. Frederick get sober. Mother retire. Vanessa enjoy the parties." Digital Julian leaned into the camera lens. "And now to Madeline." Madeline held her breath. "Madeline, Madeline, Madeline." Julian sighed, shaking his head. "My beautiful mistake. You know, when I met you, I thought your innocence was charming. But innocence is just another word for weakness. You were boring, my dear. Desperately boring. You didn't fit in my world, and frankly, you embarrassed me." Tears pricked Madeline's eyes. She remembered the nights she spent nursing him back to health, the meals she cooked, the way she tried to learn about his business, to impress him. It meant nothing. "I know you're pregnant," Julian continued, his lip curling in a sneer. "And I know you think that child is your golden ticket, your meal ticket for 18 years of child support. Well, I'm a businessman, Madeline. I don't pay for assets I don't want." Beatrice and Vanessa exchanged a look of pure glee. "So," Julian said, swirling his drink, "I am leaving you nothing." Madeline felt like she had been punched in the gut. "No cash, no properties, no stocks," Julian listed, counting on his fingers. "However, I am not a monster. I am leaving you one thing, a lesson." On the screen, Julian reached into his pocket and held up a small, rusty silver key. It looked like something you would use for a gym locker or a garden shed. "This key opens a storage unit in Queens," Julian said. "Unit 404. Inside you will find everything you are worth to me. It's a collection of my old tax receipts and some broken office furniture. You can sell the scrap metal. It might buy you a bus ticket back to wherever you came from." Julian laughed, a cruel barking sound. "Goodbye, Madeline. Don't use the Kensington name. You never really earned it." The screen went black. For 3 seconds, there was total silence. Then Beatrice burst out laughing. It was a loud, cackling sound of victory. "Oh, that is rich," Beatrice crowed. "Unit 404 broken furniture. Oh, Julian, you wicked boy." Vanessa smirked, checking her reflection in her compact mirror. "Well, that settles that." "Pendergast, When can we have her escorted off the property? I'd like to move into the master suite by tonight. Madeline sat frozen. The humiliation was burning her skin. She wasn't just disinherited. She was publicly flayed. He had planned this. He recorded a video just to twist the knife one last time. She stood up, her legs shaking. I think I'm going to be sick. Use the guest bathroom, Beatrice snapped. And then pack your bags. You have 1 hour. Actually, Pendergast's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. Everyone stopped. The lawyer hadn't closed his briefcase. He was still sitting there, his face devoid of amusement. Mrs. Kensington, Pendergast said, looking directly at Madeline. Please sit down. Why, Madeline choked out, tears finally spilling over. He left me nothing. He made that clear. I want to leave. Julian's video was recorded 6 weeks ago. Pendergast said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming very serious. However, there is a legal precedent here that Julian overlooked. Or rather, a trap he set for himself that he failed to disarm before he died. What are you talking about? Beatrice demanded. The will is clear. Pendergast reached into his briefcase again. This time he didn't pull out a will. He pulled out a thick binder bound in blue leather, stamped with the seal of the Swiss Banking Authority and a secondary seal from the Cayman Islands. Julian was under investigation by the SEC for the last 6 months, Pendergast said calmly. He was terrified of his assets being frozen, so to hide his ownership of Kensington Dynamics, he moved the controlling stake 51% of the company into a blind trust. So what? Frederick asked. The trust belongs to the family. No, Pendergast said. To make the trust legal, and to make it look like he had truly given up control, he had to name a beneficiary who was not under investigation. Someone with a clean financial record. Someone he thought he could manipulate and control forever. Pendergast slid the blue binder across the mahogany table toward Madeline. He named you Madeline. The room went dead silent. He intended to have you sign the rights back to him the moment the investigation cleared, Pendergast continued. He had the transfer papers drafted. They are right here. He held up a thin sheet of paper. Unsigned. Beatrice's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. Because he died before you signed this return document. Pendergast said, a small, rare smile touching his lips. The trust stands. The transfer is permanent. Madeline stared at the blue binder. Her hand trembled as she touched the cold leather. What does that mean? She whispered. It means, Pendergast said, looking at Beatrice and Vanessa, that Julian's personal will, the cash, the houses, the cars, is secondary. The source of the money, the company itself, the $4.2 billion empire, belongs to you, Madeline. You are the majority shareholder of Kensington Dynamics. You own the house we are sitting in. You own the jet Vanessa flew in on. You own the accounts that pay Beatrice's stipend. Pendergast closed the file. In short, Mrs. Kensington, you are their boss. The silence that had fallen over the grand study was heavy, suffocating, and electric. It was broken by the sound of crystal shattering. Beatrice had dropped her martini glass. Gin and olives soaked into the priceless Persian rug, but she didn't even look down. Her face was a mask of contorted fury, the kind of rage that makes veins bulge in the forehead. You're lying, Beatrice hissed, pointing a manicured finger at Pendergast. This is a joke, a sick, twisted legal joke. Julian would never give her the company. She's a nobody. She is your employer, Pendergast corrected, closing the blue binder with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. And legally she is the head of the Kensington estate. The deed is recorded. The shares are transferred. It is done." Vanessa Roche stood up so fast her chair tipped over. "I don't care about the company. I want my 10 million. Julian promised it to me." "About that," Pendergast said, sliding his glasses down his nose. "The 10 million was to be paid from the liquid assets of the primary account. However, since the majority of Julian's liquidity was used to pay off the SEC fines last week, another detail he neglected to mention in his video. The primary account currently has a balance of, let me check." He glanced at a tablet. $4,032. Vanessa looked like she had been slapped. 4,000, enough for a very nice economy ticket back to wherever you came from, Pendergast said, echoing Julian's cruel words from the video. Beatrice marched toward Madeline, her eyes wild. "You listen to me, you little leech. You're going to sign those papers back to the family immediately. Do you hear me? You don't know how to run a logistics empire. You'll run it into the ground in a week. Sign it over, and I will let you keep the jewelry." Madeline looked at the woman who had made her life a living hell for 2 years. She looked at Vanessa, the woman who had flaunted her affair in every tabloid. She looked at Frederick, who was currently pouring himself a stiff drink, realizing his debts were not going to be paid. Something inside Madeline shifted. The fear, the nausea, the overwhelming grief, it all calcified into something hard and cold. It was the protective instinct of a mother mixed with the burning indignation of a woman scorned. Madeline placed her hands on the table and slowly pushed herself up. She was heavy with child, her back ached, but she stood taller than she ever had in this house. "No," Madeline said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Excuse me," Beatrice sputtered. "I said no," Madeline repeated, locking eyes with her mother-in-law. "I'm not signing anything. Julian wanted to play games with the law fine. He played, he lost. And now I'm the winner." She turned to Vanessa. "You wanted the master suite, didn't you, Vanessa?" Vanessa crossed her arms, trying to look defiant, but failing. "It's what I deserve." "The master suite is currently occupied by my things," Madeline said calmly. "And since this house is now my property, I have strict rules about trespassers." Madeline looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. "You have 30 minutes to pack your bags and leave the premises. Anything left behind will be donated to charity." "You can't do that," Vanessa shrieked. "I've lived here for 6 months." "Then you have a lot of packing to do," Madeline replied icily. She turned her gaze to Beatrice. The older woman took a step back, sensing the shift in power. "And you, Beatrice," Madeline said softly. "You said you wanted to fumigate the house, I agree. It reeks of betrayal." "I am his mother," Beatrice shouted. "You cannot throw me out of my own home." "It's not your home," Madeline said. "It's mine, but I am not a monster unlike your son. You can stay." Beatrice let out a breath of relief, a smug smile returning. "Well, I knew you wouldn't dare. In the gardener's cottage," Madeline finished. Beatrice froze. The shed. It has no heating. It's full of rakes. It has a roof and a bed," Madeline said, channeling the cold indifference Julian had shown her. "If that's not up to your standards, you are free to use your $50,000 stipend to rent a condo in the city." "Oh, wait. The stipend comes from the company accounts. My company." Madeline looked at Pendergast. "Jeffrey frees all discretionary spending from the family accounts pending a full audit. I don't want a single penny leaving Kensington Dynamics until I know where it's going." "With pleasure, Mrs. Kensington." Pendergast said, a genuine smile breaking across his stone face. You witch!" Beatrice screamed, lunging forward. Higgins, the butler, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped in front of Beatrice. He had served the Kensingtons for 30 years, enduring Beatrice's abuse the entire time. "I believe Mrs. Kensington asked you to leave the main house, madam," Higgins said, his voice smooth. "Shall I call security to assist you with your luggage?" Beatrice looked at Higgins, then at Madeline, and finally realized the war was lost. She let out a guttural scream of frustration and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking violently against the floor. Frederick followed her, grabbing the bottle of scotch as he fled. Vanessa gave Madeline one last look of pure venom before running after them. The door clicked shut. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Madeline exhaled, her legs giving out. She collapsed back into the chair. Pendergast was at her side in an instant, pouring a glass of water. "Are you all right, Madeline?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm terrified," she admitted, her hand trembling as she took the water. "I don't know how to run a multi-billion-dollar company, Jeffrey. I'm an architect. I design houses, I don't move cargo ships." "You don't need to know everything today," Pendergast assured her. "You just need to survive, and you have instincts. What you just did, that was leadership." Madeline looked at the blue binder. "Why did you help me?" "You worked for Julian." Pendergast sighed, looking at the portrait of Julian hanging over the fireplace. "Julian was my client, but he was a man without a soul. He treated people like chess pieces. I have a daughter about your age, Madeline. When I saw that video, when I saw what he planned to do to you and that baby," he shook his head. "I checked the bylaws. I found the loophole. I didn't have to enforce the trust transfer so aggressively. I could have let them contest it, but I chose to hand you the sword." "Thank you," Madeline whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Pendergast said ominously. "Beatrice won't go quietly, and the board of directors at Kensington Dynamics, they are worse than the family. They are wolves, Madeline, and tomorrow morning you have to walk into their den." Madeline looked down at her stomach. She felt a strong bick. "Let them come," she said, her eyes hardening. "I have a future to protect." The Kensington Dynamics headquarters was a monolith of black glass piercing the Seattle skyline. It was 50 stories of intimidation. The next morning, Madeline stepped out of a black SUV in front of the building. She wasn't wearing her usual comfortable maternity wear. She had called a stylist at 4 a.m. She wore a tailored navy blazer that draped elegantly over her bump-dark trousers and low heels. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, sleek bun. She wore no jewelry, except her wedding ring, a reminder of what brought her here. Pendergast was by her side, carrying the blue binder like a shield. "The board is meeting on the 50th floor, Pendergast briefed her as they walked through the lobby. "They know about the will. Beatrice called Sterling Vance last night." "Who is Sterling Vance?" Madeline asked, ignoring the stares of the employees who whispered as she passed. "The CFO," Pendergast said grimly. "He's the one who actually runs the numbers. He and Julian were thick as thieves. He's been skimming off the top for years, but I could never prove it. He will try to intimidate you into selling." They reached the elevator. Pendergast scanned his badge. The doors opened to a private car. "Don't let him speak first," Pendergast advised. "Walk in. Sit at the head of the table. Own the room." The elevator ride felt like an eternity. When the doors finally slid open on the 50th floor, the air was cooler, smelling of ozone and expensive espresso. The conference room was glass-walled, offering a panoramic view of the city. 12 men and 2 women sat around a table that cost more than most people's houses. When Madeline walked in, the conversation stopped abruptly. At the head of the table sat a man who looked like a shark in a Brioni suit. He had slicked-back blonde hair, cold blue eyes, and a tan that came from spending too much time on a yacht. This was Sterling Vance. He didn't stand up. "Mrs. Kensington," Vance said, his voice smooth and oily. "We were just discussing the unfortunate clerical error regarding the estate." Madeline didn't stop walking until she reached the head of the table. She stood right next to Vance. She looked down at him. "You're in my seat, Mr. Vance," she said. Vance chuckled, looking around the table for support. "Madeline, can I call you Madeline? This is a board meeting. These are serious matters for experienced operators. Why don't you take a seat over there on the sofa? We'll order you some herbal tea while we sort this mess out." "Move," Madeline said. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated it as a fact. "Or I will have security remove you from the building and revoke your clearance before you can finish your coffee." The room went silent. Vance's smile faltered. He looked at Pendergast, who gave him a small nod, confirming the legal reality. Slowly, begrudgingly, Vance stood up and moved to a side chair. Madeline sat down. The leather chair was massive, but she didn't shrink into it. She placed the blue binder on the table. "There is no clerical error," Madeline addressed the room. "I am the majority shareholder. I am the acting chairwoman. And as my first order of business, I want to discuss the SEC investigation." The tension in the room spiked. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Vance's eyes narrowed. "That investigation is closed," Vance said quickly. "We paid the fine. It was a minor accounting discrepancy." "A $40 million discrepancy is not minor," Madeline countered, reciting the figures Pendergast had prepped her with. "And I find it interesting that my husband felt the need to hide the company in a blind trust to avoid it. Innocent men don't hide assets." Julian was paranoid, Vance dismissed. "Look, Madeline, let's be real. You're grieving. You're emotional. You're about to have a baby. You don't want the stress of running a logistics chain that spans 3 continents. I have a proposal." Vance slid a folder across the table. "We have an offer from a holding company in Dubai," Vance said. "They are willing to buy your 51% share for $2 billion. Cash. You walk away today. You never have to deal with us, the press, or the SEC ever again. You can raise your child in luxury." $2 billion. It was a tempting escape hatch. Madeline looked at the folder. "Who is the holding company?" she asked. "Just an investment group," Vance said too quickly. Madeline opened the folder. The paperwork was dense, but one name caught her eye on the signatory line. Vanguard Shipping. She remembered that name. Julian used to argue on the phone about Vanguard. He hated them. He said they were front-runners for something else. "No," Madeline said, closing the folder. "Excuse me." Vance blinked. "It's $2 billion. "I'm not selling," Madeline said. "And I'm not stepping down. In fact, I'm ordering a full forensic audit of the company, starting with the logistics department in Queens." Vance's face went pale. "Queens? Why Queens?" "That's just a holding depot." "Is it?" Madeline asked. She was bluffing, but Julian's video came back to her. Unit 404, Queens. Julian said it was trash, but Julian was a liar, and Vance's reaction confirmed it. "The audit starts Monday," Madeline declared, standing up. "And Mr. Vance, if I find one shipping container unaccounted for, you won't just be fired. You'll be in prison." She turned and walked out of the room, Pendergast trailing her. She felt like she was going to faint, her heart rate skyrocketing. But she held her head high until the elevator doors closed. As soon as they were alone, she grabbed Pendergast's arm. "Did you see his face when I mentioned Queens?" "I did," Pendergast said, looking worried. "You struck a nerve, a dangerous one." "Julian left me a key," Madeline said, her mind racing. "In the video, He said Unit 404 in Queens was full of his old tax receipts and broken furniture. He mocked it. Julian never did anything without a reason, Pendergast mused. If he wanted to humiliate you, he would have just left you nothing. Why give you a key? Why give you a specific location? It's not trash, is it? Madeline realized. It's leverage. We need to go there, Pendergast said. Now, before Vance sends someone to clean it out. I'm driving, Madeline said, heading for the garage. Madeline, you're 8 months pregnant. And I'm the only one with the key, she retorted. They took Pendergast's car, a nondescript sedan, to avoid attention. The drive to Queens was tense. The rain had returned, hammering against the windshield. Madeline checked the rearview mirror, constantly paranoid that the black SUV behind them was following. They arrived at Safekeep Storage, a run-down facility near the docks. It was a maze of corrugated metal hallways, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. Unit 404 was at the end of a long, damp corridor. Madeline's hands shook as she pulled the rusty key from her purse, the key Pendergast had retrieved from Julian's personal effects box. She slid the key into the padlock. It turned with a stiff click. Pendergast rolled up the metal door. It rattled loudly, echoing through the empty facility. They peered inside. At first glance, it was exactly what Julian had said. There was an old, broken office chair, stacks of cardboard boxes labeled 2010 taxes. A dusty lamp. Is this it? Madeline asked, her heart sinking. Was he really just playing a joke? Pendergast stepped inside, using his phone as a flashlight. He kicked aside a box of receipts. Julian was arrogant, but he wasn't petty about storage fees. He paid for this unit for 10 years. Why keep trash for 10 years? Madeline walked to the back of the unit. The wall was covered in cheap wood paneling. She noticed a scratch on the floor, a semicircle groove, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. Jeffrey, she called out. Look at the floor. Pendergast shone the light. A false wall. He pushed against the wood paneling. It groaned but didn't move. He felt along the edge and found a small latch hidden behind the molding. He triggered it. The panel swung open. Behind the false wall was a small climate-controlled room about the size of a walk-in closet. In the center was a single server rack with blinking green lights humming softly. And next to it, a wall of filing cabinets. My God, Pendergast whispered. It's an off-grid server. Madeline stepped into the hidden room. She pulled open the top drawer of the filing cabinet. It wasn't tax receipts. The files were labeled with dates and code names. Project Acheron, the Senator, the shipment. She pulled a folder at random. Photos spilled out. They were surveillance photos. One showed Sterling Vance shaking hands with a man in a military uniform. Another showed a Kensington Dynamics shipping container being loaded with crates that were definitely not consumer goods. They weren't just skimming money, Madeline whispered, horror dawning on her. They were smuggling. Weapons, Pendergast said, looking at a manifest he had picked up. Illegal arms dealing. Using the logistics network to bypass customs. Julian wasn't just a CEO. He was a broker. That's why he hid the company, Madeline realized. If this got out, the company wouldn't just go bankrupt. He would go to federal prison for life. He put the company in my name, so if the bust happened, I would be the one holding the bag. He set you up, Pendergast said, his voice trembling with rage. He didn't just disinherit you. He framed you. Suddenly, a loud screech of tires echoed from outside the storage unit. Car doors slammed. There she is, a voice shouted. It was unmistakable. It was Frederick. Check the unit, Vance said they might be here. Another voice yelled, rougher, deeper. Hired muscle. They found us. Madeline gasped, clutching the folder to her chest. Pendergast slammed the false wall shut, plunging them into darkness save for the blinking server lights. "Lock the door," Pendergast hissed. Madeline fumbled for the latch from the inside just as footsteps thundered into the outer unit. "It's empty," Frederick yelled. "Just the trash, like Julian said." "Check the walls," the rough voice commanded. "Vance said Julian was a tricky bastard." Madeline held her breath, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She was trapped in a steel box with the evidence that could destroy them all, and the people who wanted her dead were standing 3 feet away. Then she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. Not a kick. A contraction. Her water broke. The cramped, hidden server room felt like a coffin. The air was hot, smelling of ozone and old dust. The only light came from the frantic blinking of the server LEDs and the flashlight beam Pendergast had pointed at the floor. Madeline gripped the metal shelving unit, her knuckles white. Another contraction seized her body, a wave of pain so intense it stole her breath. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, tasting blood. "Madeline!" Pendergast whispered, his voice laced with panic. He looked at the puddle of water on the concrete floor. "We need to get you to a hospital. Now!" "We can't," Madeline gasped, sweat beading on her forehead. "They're right outside." Crack. A heavy boot kicked the wooden paneling of the false wall. Dust rained down on them. "I heard something," the rough voice shouted from the main storage unit. "Behind the wood. It sounds hollow." "Break it down!" Frederick's voice screamed, manic and high-pitched. "Tear it apart!" The wood splintered as a crowbar smashed through the drywall. A jagged beam of light from the outer room cut through the darkness, illuminating Madeline's terrified face. "Stay behind me," Pendergast said. He wasn't a fighter. He was a 60-year-old contract lawyer in a bespoke suit, but he picked up a heavy metal hard drive from the shelf, holding it like a brick. The false wall gave way with a deafening crash. The wood paneling was ripped aside, revealing the 2 fugitives huddled in the secret nerve center of Julian's criminal empire. Frederick stepped through the debris holding a silver pistol. His eyes widened when he saw the server rack the files, and Madeline slumped against the wall. "Well, well," Frederick sneered, his gun shaking slightly. "Julian really was a paranoid bastard, a kill switch." He looked at the files in Pendergast's hands. "Hand it over Jeffrey, and the drive. Vance wants it all burned." "This is evidence of treason, Frederick," Pendergast said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "Arms dealing, sanction violations. If you destroy this, you're an accessory to federal crimes. You'll go away for life." "I'm already in deep," Frederick yelled, sweat pouring down his face. "Vance owns my debt. If I don't bring him this, I'm dead anyway. Give it to me." "No," Madeline said. She pushed herself off the wall, standing up. Her dress was ruined, her hair plastered to her face, her body racked with the early stages of labor. But her eyes were blazing. "Madeline, get down," Pendergast warned. "You won't shoot," Madeline said, staring Frederick down. She took a step forward, clutching her stomach. "I will," Frederick shouted, raising the gun. "I swear to God, Madeline, I just want the money. I just want my cut. Shoot me then," she screamed, her voice cracking with pain and fury. "Shoot a pregnant woman in front of a witness. See how far that gets you. You think Vance will protect you? You're the loose end, Frederick. He sent you here to do the dirty work so he could frame you too." Frederick hesitated. The gun wavered. The logic pierced through his drug-addled panic. He said we were partners," Frederick stammered. "He lied." Madeline yelled, doubling over as another contraction hit her harder this time. She groaned a guttural sound of agony. "Just like Julian lied. They use people like us, Frederick. They use us and throw us away." The hired muscle. A large man in a leather jacket stepped forward, shoving Frederick aside. "Enough talking. Boss said no witnesses." The man lunged at Pendergast. Pendergast swung the hard drive, catching the man in the shoulder, but the thug was stronger. He backhanded the lawyer, sending Pendergast crashing into the server rack. Sparks flew. "No!" Madeline screamed. The thug turned to Madeline, reaching for her throat. Suddenly, a piercing siren wailed, echoing off the metal walls of the storage facility. It was deafeningly loud. Red strobe lights began to flash in the hallway outside. "What did you do?" Frederick screamed, spinning around. Pendergast, bleeding from his lip, held up his cell phone. "I didn't call the police, Frederick. I triggered the fire suppression system for the entire block. The fire department is 3 minutes away, and the police always roll with them for commercial alarms." "We have to go," the thug yelled, looking at the flashing lights. "Forget the drive, the cops will trap us in here." "But Vance needs—" Frederick started. "Vance isn't here," the thug shouted, grabbing Frederick by the collar. "Move!" They scrambled backward, abandoning the room. Frederick took one last look at Madeline, a look of pure, pathetic fear, before running into the darkness of the corridor. Madeline collapsed to her knees, the adrenaline crashing. "Jeffrey," she whispered. "The baby. It's coming." Pendergast pulled himself up, wiping blood from his mouth. He knelt beside her, taking off his suit jacket to make a pillow. "Okay," he said, his voice trembling but gentle. "Okay. I've negotiated billion-dollar mergers, Madeline. I can handle this. Just breathe." Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. "The files," Madeline gasped, pointing to the cabinet. Don't let them disappear." "I'm guarding them with my life," Pendergast promised. He took her hand. "But right now you have a more important job." The rain had finally stopped. For 3 days, a relentless storm had battered Seattle, mirroring the chaos that had erupted in the bowels of Queens. But now, through the reinforced glass of the VIP suite at St. Jude's Hospital, the sky was a piercing, innocent blue. The sunlight didn't just shine, it felt like it was scrubbing the city clean. Madeline sat upright in the hospital bed, the mechanical hum of the adjustable mattress, the only sound in the room. She was exhausted, her body feeling as though it had been dismantled and slowly put back together. Her muscles ached from the tension of the standoff, and her throat was still raw from screaming over the wail of the fire alarms. But none of that mattered. Resting in the crook of her arm, wrapped in a blanket woven from soft, white, organic cotton, was her daughter. Madeline traced the curve of the infant's cheek with her index finger. The baby was tiny, fragile, yet she possessed a gravity that anchored Madeline to the earth. She had named her Hope. It was a cliché, perhaps, but after staring down the barrel of a gun in a damp storage unit, it felt like the only word that made sense. The heavy oak door to the suite clicked open. Madeline didn't flinch. She had spent the last 72 hours being interviewed by federal agents, signing medical forms and giving statements. She expected another nurse. Instead, Jeffrey Pendergast walked in. The formidable lawyer looked like he had gone 12 rounds with a prizefighter. His left arm was encased in a navy blue sling, and a stark white bandage covered a row of stitches above his right eyebrow, where the hard drive had connected with the thug's fist. Yet despite the bruising, he wore a fresh, impeccably tailored charcoal suit. He carried a tablet under his good arm. "You look terrible, Jeffrey," Madeline said, her voice soft but warm. "You should see the other guys," Pendergast replied, a dry smile touching his lips as he approached the bed. "Actually, you can't, because they are currently being processed at the Federal Detention Center." "Is it over?" Madeline asked, clutching Hope a little tighter. Pendergast pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down with a heavy sigh of relief. He tapped the screen of his tablet and turned it toward her. "It's more than over, Madeline. It's a demolition." The screen displayed a breaking news headline, Kensington Empire crumbles CEO and board indicted in international arms trafficking ring. Sterling Vance was apprehended on the tarmac at SeaTac. Pendergast explained, his tone grimly satisfied. He was trying to board a private charter to the Maldives. He didn't make it up the stairs. The files we secured from the server room linked him directly to the sale of prohibited guidance systems to 3 embargoed nations. He's looking at charges of treason, conspiracy, and racketeering. He'll never see the outside of a cell again. And Frederick? Madeline asked, her stomach tightening at the memory of her brother-in-law pointing a gun at her. Frederick is a coward, Pendergast said dismissively. The moment the police surrounded the storage unit, he dropped the gun and fell to his knees. He's cut a deal. He's testifying against Vance and the rest of the board in exchange for a reduced sentence. He'll serve 10 years minimum, but he's destroyed his own family name in the process. Madeline looked down at her daughter. The name was already destroyed, Jeffrey. They just didn't know it yet. There is one other matter, Pendergast said, his demeanor shifting. He looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the hallway. Beatrice. She's here, isn't she? Madeline said. It wasn't a question. She's been in the waiting room since 6 a.m., Pendergast admitted. She's been threatening to sue the hospital administration if they don't let her see her granddaughter. She claims she had no knowledge of the arms dealing, and technically the FBI agrees. She was just a beneficiary of the trust, not an operator. She's not going to prison. Madeline closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. She could feel the ghost of the old Madeline, the one who wanted to please, the one who wanted to be accepted, trying to surface. That Madeline would have let Beatrice in out of guilt. That Madeline would have sought approval. But that Madeline had died in the storage unit. Let her in, Madeline said, her eyes opening clear and cold. Pendergast nodded and texted security. A moment later, the door opened. Beatrice Kensington swept into the room. She was dressed in black silk, her hair perfectly coiffed, her pearls luminous. But up close, the cracks in the porcelain were visible. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were darting around the room, frantic, assessing the damage to her world. She stopped at the foot of the bed. She didn't look at Madeline. She looked solely at the baby. Is that her? Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and possessiveness. This is Hope, Madeline said. Beatrice took a step forward, her hand reaching out instinctively. She looks like Julian. The nose, that's the Kensington nose. She has my nose, Madeline corrected, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. And she has my eyes. She is a Carter, Beatrice. She has nothing to do with the Kensingtons. Beatrice recoiled as if slapped. She straightened her spine, attempting to summon the imperious matriarch she had played for decades. Now listen here, Madeline. I know we have had our differences, and I am shocked by what Frederick and Vance did. But I am still her grandmother. We are the only family left. We must present a united front to the press. We need to protect the assets that remain. Madeline stared at the woman. Even now, with her son in jail and her empire in ashes, Beatrice was thinking about PR strategies. There are no assets, Beatrice, Madeline said calmly. Don't be ridiculous, Beatrice scoffed. The company is in trouble, yes, but the real estate portfolio alone is worth hundreds of millions. The London estate, the Aspen Lodge, the art collection. We can liquidate the logistics arm, rebrand the holdings, and live very comfortably. I've already spoken to a crisis manager. Madeline looked at Pendergast. Jeffrey, give her the file. Pendergast handed Beatrice a thick manila envelope stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice and a private liquidation firm. Beatrice opened it, scanning the pages. Her face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. What is this? She stammered. Total liquidation donation of proceeds, Victims of War Relief Fund. I signed the papers this morning, Madeline said. "I am the majority shareholder and the sole executor of the estate. I am selling everything, Beatrice. The company, the houses, the cars, the jewelry, even the furniture." "You can't," Beatrice shrieked, the paper shaking in her hands. "That is my money. That is my life." "It was never your money," Madeline said, her voice rising with the authority of a judge delivering a verdict. "It was money made by smuggling weapons that killed innocent people. Every champagne toast you drank, every pearl on your neck, it was paid for with blood. I won't let that touch my daughter. I'm burning it all down." "But what about me?" Beatrice cried, tears of genuine terror streaming down her face. "I'm an old woman. I have no skills. I have nowhere to go. You're leaving me destitute." Madeline adjusted the blanket around Hope, looking at her sleeping child with a fierce, protective love. Then she looked back at the woman who had tormented her for years. "You're not destitute, Beatrice. You're just like everyone else now," Madeline said. "You're healthy. You have 2 hands. I remember you once told me that working as a barista was unskilled labor, suitable only for people with no ambition. Well, Starbucks is hiring down the street. Maybe you'll learn something about hard work." You monster," Beatrice hissed. "I'm not a monster," Madeline said softly. "I'm a mother cleaning up a mess. Now get out. You're scaring my daughter." Beatrice looked at Pendergast for help, but the lawyer merely opened the door and gestured to the hallway. "Madam," Pendergast said. Beatrice Kensington let out a sob, a sound of pure defeated vanity, and turned around. She walked out of the room, her heels clicking on the linoleum, a dethroned queen entering a world she no longer understood. When the door clicked shut, the silence that followed was heavy, but pure. "You really did it," Pendergast said, looking at Madeline with profound respect. "You gave away $4 billion. "I didn't give it away," Madeline said, looking out at the sunlit city. "I paid a ransom. I bought my freedom. And hers." She looked down at Hope. The baby stirred, opening her eyes. They were bright, clear, and full of infinite potential. "We're going to be fine, aren't we?" Madeline whispered to the baby. She didn't have a mansion. She didn't have a private jet. But she had the truth. She had her dignity. And for the first time in her life, she had a future that belonged entirely to her. Madeline smiled, and it was the brightest thing in the room. "Yes," she answered herself. "We're going to be just fine." Madeline Carter's story is a powerful reminder that dignity and truth are worth more than any bank account. She walked into a den of wolves, heavily pregnant, ridiculed, and alone, but she walked out a mother, a survivor, and a victor. She stripped a corrupt dynasty of its power not by playing their game, but by ending it entirely. In a world obsessed with wealth, Madeline chose integrity, proving that the best revenge isn't just living well, it's living free of the toxicity that tries to destroy you. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and subscribe for more incredible real-life dramas and storytelling. What would you have done in Madeline's shoes? Kept the billions or donated it all? Let me know in the comments below. A single piece of paper should have been her vindication. For a pregnant Alice Hayes, the DNA test clutched in her trembling hand was the absolute truth, the legal key to securing her unborn child's future. But when she presented it in the hallowed halls of a Charleston family court, the only response she received was laughter. It was cold, cruel, and confident laughter from her husband's mistress, the immaculate Victoria Vance. The judge looked on a flicker of pity in his eyes as a second test confirmed the impossible David Hayes, Alice's husband of 10 years, was not the father. Her world didn't just crack, it imploded. But what if the science itself was telling a lie? What if the deepest, most shocking betrayals are written not in our hearts, but in our very blood? The late afternoon sun, thick and golden, as honey streamed through the Palladian windows of the Hayes residence in Charleston's historic South of Broad neighborhood. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, glittering secret. For Alice Hayes, this light had once been a symbol of warmth and clarity. Now it felt accusatory, exposing the fine cracks in the porcelain veneer of her life. At 38, she was 7 months pregnant with the child she and her husband David had yearned for, a small miracle after years of quiet heartache and sterile clinics. The nursery was painted a soft, hopeful shade of seafoam green. A handcrafted wooden mobile of celestial bodies bought on their last anniversary trip to Asheville hung over the crib, waiting for tiny eyes to gaze up at it. Everything was perfect. Except it was all a lie. David Hayes was a man sculpted from ambition and old Charleston money. He was a partner at a private equity firm, a world of crisp suits, hushed phone calls, and numbers that could alter the fates of companies. He moved with an easy confidence that Alice had once found intoxicating. He'd courted her with the same strategic precision he applied to a hostile takeover. Flowers every Tuesday, surprise weekend, getaways, whispered promises of a future as solid and grand as the antebellum homes surrounding them. She, a talented art historian who had put her career on hold, had believed him. She had built her entire world within the beautiful gilded cage of their marriage. The first crack appeared not as a dramatic fissure, but as a hairline fracture, almost invisible to the naked eye. It was the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his suit jacket, a heady, expensive scent of tuberose and sandalwood. When she'd asked, he'd laughed it off. Victoria's, probably. We were crammed into a taxi after the merger dinner. The woman marinates in it. Victoria Vance. Her name, spoken so casually, landed like a stone in a tranquil pond. Victoria was David's newest partner at the firm, a fiercely intelligent woman with a razor-sharp wit and a wardrobe to match. Alice had met her a few times at corporate events. She was all sharp angles and predatory smiles, the kind of woman who didn't walk into a room so much as conquer it. Then came the late nights blamed on market volatility in Asia. The weekend trips for emergency meetings that left him looking exhausted but strangely energized. The way he angled his phone away from her, the screen going dark the moment she entered the room. Alice was not a fool, but she was a master of self-deception, an expert at papering over the cracks to preserve the beautiful facade. The baby, this precious, long-awaited child, was supposed to be the mortar that sealed their foundation forever. The illusion finally shattered on a rainy Tuesday. David had claimed to be in a late-night negotiation. Alice, unable to sleep, the baby kicking restlessly beneath her ribs, had driven to his office building downtown. His car, a sleek black Mercedes, was not in its designated spot in the parking garage. A cold dread, slick and oily, coated her throat. On a desperate whim, she drove past The Spectator, a chic, dimly lit hotel bar he and his colleagues sometimes frequented. And there it was, his car parked right outside. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. She sat in her own car across the street, the rain blurring the world outside her heart, hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. An hour later, they emerged. David, and Victoria. They weren't talking business. His hand was resting possessively on the small of her back. As they paused under the hotel's awning, Victoria reached up, straightened his tie with an air of practiced intimacy, and then rose on her toes to kiss him. It wasn't a fleeting, friendly peck. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, a claim. David's hands came up to cup her face, pulling her closer. Alice felt the air leave her lungs in a silent scream. The world tilted the streetlights, smearing into abstract streaks of pain. She drove home in a daze, the sound of the windshield wipers mimicking the frantic, repetitive thought in her head, "It's real, it's real, it's real." When David came home hours later, smelling of rain and that same tuberose perfume, she was waiting for him in the grand foyer, the single lamp, casting long, distorted shadows. "Alice, what are you doing up so late?" he asked, his voice a practiced melody of concern. "The Spectator," she said, her own voice sounding foreign, brittle. "How was the emergency meeting?" The practiced smile on his face faltered. For a split second she saw him for what he was, a cornered animal calculating his escape. "It was a long night. We grabbed a final drink to celebrate." "You kissed her, David." The words were quiet, but they held the weight of a death sentence. "You stood under the awning, and you kissed her, like you used to kiss me." The gaslighting came next, a torrent of denials and accusations. She was being hormonal, overly emotional. Her pregnancy was making her paranoid. He was under immense pressure at work, and this was how she supported him. He was a master manipulator, twisting her own reality until she almost doubted the evidence of her own eyes. But the image was seared into her brain, a permanent scar on her memory. The fight escalated, the whispers turning to shouts that echoed through the perfect, silent house. It ended with David's cold, final declaration. "This marriage is over, Alice," he said, his face a mask of detached cruelty. "It has been for a long time." He paused, delivering the final devastating blow. "And don't for a second think you're getting a free ride. That baby you're carrying. We both know the struggles we had. I want a paternity test. I'm not paying a cent in child support until I see definitive proof." The demand was so audacious, so profoundly cruel, that it shocked her into silence. After years of shared tears in fertility clinics, of holding her hand through invasive procedures, of celebrating the positive test with what she thought were genuine tears of joy, he was now using their most private pain as a weapon against her. He was not just leaving her. He was trying to erase her, to invalidate her motherhood, to sever the very biological bond that tied them together. In that moment, something inside Alice hardened. The grief was still there, a vast black ocean threatening to drown her. But beneath it, a new, unyielding bedrock of resolve was forming. He wanted proof. He wanted a fight. He would get one. She would not be erased. She would walk into that courtroom with her head held high, armed with the undeniable truth of science. She would prove he was the father not for his sake, but for her child's. She would secure their future, and she would make David Hayes face the one thing he could not manipulate or deny, the simple biological truth. Or so she thought. The days that followed were a blur of cold reality. David moved out his departure as swift and efficient as a business transaction. He left behind a house that suddenly felt cavernous and hostile, every object a ghost of a shared memory. His lawyer, a piranha in a $1,000 suit named Robert Thorne, sent the first volley a divorce petition that was as brutal as it was insulting. It painted Alice as an unstable, gold-digging spouse and formally demanded a court-adjudicated DNA test to establish paternity before any discussion of child support or alimony. Alice's sister Sarah flew in from Atlanta, her presence a warm, steadying anchor in the maelstrom. It was Sarah who found Ms. Diana Finch, a family law attorney whose reputation was built on a combination of sharp legal acumen and fierce compassion. Ms. Finch's office, located in a restored historic building, was the antithesis of Robert Thorne's chrome and glass tower. It was filled with books, warm wood, and the faint scent of Earl Grey tea, a sanctuary of calm competence. "He's trying to build a narrative, Alice," Ms. Finch explained during their first meeting, her voice calm and measured as she reviewed the petition. "He wants to paint you as deceitful, to minimize his own culpability, and more importantly, his financial liability. The paternity demand is a classic ugly tactic. It's designed to humiliate you and cast doubt on your character from the outset." Alice sat stiffly, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. "But we went through 3 rounds of IVF, Diana. He was there. He held my hand. He signed the consent forms. It's his child. There is no question." "I believe you," Ms. Finch said, her eyes meeting Alice's with unwavering sincerity. "And we have the records from the fertility clinic, which will be crucial. But Mr. Thorne is going to argue that those records don't preclude the possibility of infidelity. It's despicable, but it's the game he'll play. So we will play our own game. We'll beat them at it." The strategy was simple: get ahead of their demand. Ms. Finch recommended a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, NIPT. It was a cutting-edge procedure that could determine paternity with over 99% accuracy as early as 7 weeks into pregnancy by analyzing the fetal DNA fragments circulating in the mother's bloodstream and comparing them to a DNA sample from the potential father. "We do our own test with a reputable certified lab," Ms. Finch advised. "We get the results and we walk into that preliminary hearing with irrefutable proof. It will shut down Mr. Thorne's entire strategy before he even gets a chance to deploy it. It cuts the legs out from under his argument and shows the court that his demand is nothing more than a malicious tactic to harass a pregnant woman." The logistics were cold and clinical. A kit was sent to their respective locations. Alice went to a sterile lab, a kind nurse drawing vials of her blood. David, according to his lawyer, provided a cheek swab sample at a facility across town. The process felt deeply violating, reducing the miracle of her pregnancy to a chain of custody and a bar-coded specimen bag. Every step was a fresh reminder of David's betrayal. He wasn't just denying their history. He was attempting to scientifically sever his connection to their future. While they waited for the results, the legal battle intensified. Thorne sent discovery requests demanding years of Alice's personal financial records diaries and even correspondences with friends searching for any hint of indiscretion. He filed motions to limit her access to their joint accounts, effectively trying to starve her out. It was a war of attrition, and David, with his vast resources and Victoria's strategic mind whispering in his ear, was fighting to win at any cost. Alice spent her days surrounded by stacks of legal documents, the fine print blurring into a meaningless jumble. The seafoam green nursery, once a source of joy, now felt like a room in a stranger's house. She would sit in the rocking chair, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move, and whisper promises to him. "I'm fighting for you," she would say, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what he says, no matter what he does, you are wanted, and you are loved. And you are your father's son." One evening, Sarah found her weeping silently in the nursery. "This is what he wants, Alice," Sarah said, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. "He wants you to break. He and that viper Victoria are banking on you being too exhausted and too heartbroken to fight back. You can't let them win." "How can he do this?" Alice whispered the question she'd asked herself 1,000 times. "How can he look at everything we built, everything we went through to have this baby, and just Try to burn it all to the ground. Because he's weak, Sarah said, her voice firm. And he's being controlled by a woman who sees you and this baby as a threat to her position and his wallet. This isn't about love anymore, Alice. It's a business deal. You are a liability they are trying to mitigate. Sarah's words were harsh, but they were true. Stripped of emotion, this was a strategic battle. Understanding that gave Alice a strange sense of clarity. She wasn't just a scorned wife. She was an opponent. And she would not be underestimated. A week later, a crisp, sealed envelope arrived via courier at Ms. Finch's office. The results were in. Alice's hands trembled as Diana opened it, her own heart pounding in her ears. She knew logically what it would say. But David's campaign of psychological warfare had been so effective that a sliver of doubt, a poisonous seed, had been planted in her mind. Ms. Finch unfolded the single sheet of paper, her eyes scanning the technical jargon. A slow, relieved smile spread across her face. She turned the paper around for Alice to see. There, in bold, unambiguous print, was the conclusion: probability of paternity, 99.999%. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming that it felt like a physical weight lifting from her chest. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in weeks, they were tears not of sorrow, but of vindication. It was here. The truth printed in black and white, her weapon, her shield. "This is it," Ms. Finch said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "This is the ball game. We'll file this with the court tomorrow. Thorne and his client won't know what hit them." Alice clutched the report to her chest, the paper crinkling in her hand. It felt like the most precious document in the world. She finally had her proof. The legal gauntlet had been grueling, but she had navigated it. Now, all that was left was to present the undeniable truth in court and watch David's web of lies fall to pieces. She pictured his face, Victoria's face, when the judge read the result. She would finally have her justice. The thought gave her a strength she hadn't felt in months. She was ready. The Charleston County Family Court was an imposing building of marble and mahogany designed to convey a sense of gravitas and unassailable authority. To Alice, it felt like a coliseum, and she was a gladiator about to face the lions. She walked through the heavy double doors with Ms. Finch by her side, her back straight, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly. The DNA test result was nestled in a crisp file folder in her lawyer's briefcase, a talisman against the impending storm. David and his lawyer, Robert Thorne, were already seated at the opposing table. David looked impeccable in a navy suit, his face a mask of detached indifference. He refused to meet her gaze, focusing instead on some distant point on the wall behind her. But it was Victoria Vance who truly took Alice's breath away. She wasn't seated in the gallery where a casual observer might sit. She was at the table right next to David, a stack of papers in front of her, as if she were part of his legal team. She wore a severe blood-red dress that stood in stark contrast to the courtroom's somber tones. She looked at Alice, and a slow, smug smile spread across her lips. It was a look of utter confidence, of someone who knew the outcome of a game before it had even begun. The sight of her so brazen and triumphant sent a hot spike of anger through Alice's veins, momentarily eclipsing her fear. This woman had not only stolen her husband, but was now attempting to orchestrate the demolition of her life in a public forum. "Her presence here is highly irregular," Ms. Finch whispered to Alice. Her eyes narrowed. "It's pure intimidation. Ignore her. Focus on the judge." Judge Harrison entered, a stern, gray-haired man whose expression suggested he had seen every form of human misery and was impressed by none of it. The proceedings began with a dry recitation of case numbers and legal formalities. Mr. Thorne spoke first, his voice smooth and commanding. Your Honor, we are here today on a simple matter of due diligence. My client, Mr. Hayes, has reason to question the paternity of the child being carried by Mrs. Hayes. Before any further discussions regarding marital assets or support, we contend that this fundamental issue must be resolved. We have therefore filed a motion to compel a court-ordered paternity test. Ms. Finch rose gracefully. Your Honor, we find this motion to be not only unnecessary, but also a clear act of malicious litigation intended to cause distress to my client during a vulnerable time. Mr. Hayes's sudden doubts are a transparent attempt to shirk his responsibilities. She paused for effect, letting her words hang in the silent room. However, in the interest of resolving this matter swiftly and putting an end to Mr. Hayes's baseless accusations, we have already taken the liberty of securing a DNA test. She walked to the clerk and submitted the report from the certified lab. This is the result of a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, Your Honor, conducted by GenTrack Diagnostics, a leader in the field. It was performed last month with samples provided by both my client and Mr. Hayes. The chain of custody was impeccable. Judge Harrison took the document, his eyes scanning the page. Alice held her breath, her gaze fixed on David. His mask of indifference finally slipped. A flicker of something confusion, anxiety crossed his face. He glanced at Victoria, who gave him a subtle, reassuring shake of her head. Her smile never wavered. The report states, Judge Harrison said, his voice booming in the quiet room, a 99.999% probability of paternity. It seems quite conclusive, Mr. Thorne. With all due respect, Your Honor, Thorne boomed, stepping forward, we strongly object to the admission of this privately commissioned document. We have no way of verifying the integrity of the sample provided by Mrs. Hayes or the lab's procedures. It is for this very reason that court-ordered testing is the standard. In fact, Your Honor, we were so certain of the need for an impartial test that we commissioned one ourselves through a court-approved facility using the same samples provided for the test Mrs. Hayes has presented. A cold knot of dread formed in Alice's stomach. This was an ambush. Thorne produced his own sealed envelope with a theatrical flourish. We received the results this morning, Your Honor, and they tell a very, very different story. He handed the report to the judge. Alice watched as Judge Harrison's eyebrows furrowed. He read the document, then reread it, his expression shifting from mild impatience to genuine surprise. He looked from the paper to Alice, a hint of pity in his eyes. Mr. Thorne, the judge said slowly, this report from the Charleston Forensics Laboratory states that the probability of your client, David Hayes, being the biological father is 0%. The words hit Alice like a physical blow. What? The sound escaped her lips as a strangled gasp. No, that's impossible. That's a lie. And then it happened. Victoria Vance laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a full, unrestrained laugh, rich with derision and triumph. The sound echoed in the silent, wood-paneled courtroom. It was the most soul-crushing sound Alice had ever heard. It was the sound of her own humiliation, her deepest truth being publicly mocked. Every head in the courtroom turned to stare at her. She felt her face burn with shame. In that moment, she was exactly what David and Victoria wanted her to be, a hysterical, deceitful woman caught in a lie. Ms. Finch was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This is a fabrication. There must be a mistake, a tampered sample, a clerical error." "A mistake, Ms. Finch," Thorne interjected smoothly. "Or an admission of the truth that my client has suspected all along. It seems Mrs. Hayes is the one who has been fabricating things." David remained silent, but he finally looked at Alice. There was no sympathy in his eyes, only a cold, hard judgment. It was the look of a man who had successfully framed an innocent person for a crime. Alice's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. A mistake. A switched sample. Could David have paid someone off? How could two tests on the same samples produce polar opposite results? The world felt unreal, a dizzying nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her truth, the one thing she had clung to, had been stolen and twisted into a lie. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Order, I will have order." He looked at the two conflicting reports in his hands, then at Alice's stricken face and Victoria's triumphant smirk. "We have two certified lab reports with diametrically opposed conclusions. This is a highly unusual situation." He looked down at Alice, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Hayes, the evidence presented by the petitioner is compelling. While I note the discrepancy, the burden of proof is on you." He sighed, a man clearly frustrated by the morning's drama. "Given the contradictory nature of these documents, the court has no choice but to order a second test, a new one. Samples from both parties will be collected here today by a court-appointed phlebotomist. They will be sealed in my presence and sent to a neutral, out-of-state facility for analysis. We will reconvene when those results are available." For David and Victoria, this was a victory. They had successfully muddied the waters, transforming Alice's undeniable truth into a he said, she said circus. As the judge adjourned the hearing, Victoria leaned over and whispered something in David's ear, and he finally smiled. Alice felt a hand on her arm. It was Ms. Finch, her face grim but resolute. "Alice, breathe. This is not over. I don't know what trick they just pulled, but we are going to find out. Do you hear me? This is not over." But as Alice walked out of the courtroom, the sound of Victoria's laughter still ringing in her ears, she felt like it was. She had walked in with the truth, and now she was leaving in disgrace, her credibility shattered, publicly branded as a liar and an adulteress. The whole world thought she was a fraud, and the one person who knew the truth was the man who had orchestrated her downfall. The weeks following the court hearing were the darkest of Alice's life. The public humiliation was a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. Whispers seemed to follow her everywhere, from the grocery store to her own quiet street. She felt the pitying glances, the judgmental stares. David's narrative had taken root. She was the spurned wife, trying to trap a wealthy man with a child that wasn't his. Robert Thorne had leaked details of the conflicting DNA tests to the local society columns, framing the story with a sympathetic bent toward David, the powerful man betrayed. Alice retreated into the sanctuary of her home, but even there, the silence was suffocating. Every ticking clock seemed to be counting down to her final, official ruin. She felt a profound sense of despair, a bone-deep weariness that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. The second DNA test, the tiebreaker, felt less like an opportunity and more like a formality before her sentence was read. What if it too came back negative? What kind of sorcery were David and Victoria capable of? The doubt they had so expertly planted began to sprout toxic weeds in her mind. Ms. Finch was her only lifeline. The shrewd attorney was utterly convinced of foul play. "Judges hate this kind of circus, Alice," she said during one of their many calls. "But they are bound by evidence. Right now it's a battle of the labs. We need more than just your word. We need to find a flaw in their evidence. A crack. Something." Diana Finch was methodical. She subpoenaed every piece of paper associated with both DNA tests, lab intake forms, chain of custody documents, analyst notes, machine calibration records. For days, she and a paralegal pored over the hundreds of pages of technical data, a sea of jargon and numbers. Alice sat with them trying to help, but her mind was a fog of grief and anxiety. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic smoking gun. It was a tiny, almost insignificant detail buried deep within the paperwork from the fertility clinic documents they had acquired to prove David's participation in the IVF process. "That's odd," Ms. Finch murmured late one evening, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She was staring at an intake form from 2 years prior from their very first IVF consultation. "What is it?" Alice asked, her voice listless. "It's David's family medical history form. He filled it out himself." She pointed to a section. "Blood type. He listed himself as O negative." "Yes, that's right," Alice confirmed. "He always said he was the universal donor. It was a point of pride for him." "Right," Diana said, her fingers drumming on the table. "But look at this." She slid one of the reports from the court-approved Lab Thorne's lab across the table. It was a detailed genetic marker analysis. This lab, as part of their standard process, also determined his blood type from the DNA sample. According to this, the sample he provided is from a person with AB-positive blood. Alice stared at the two conflicting pieces of information. O negative, AB positive. They were not just different, they were genetically incompatible. A person couldn't be both. "He must have filled out the form wrong," Alice said, though the excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. "A man as meticulous as your husband," Ms. Finch countered, her eyes gleaming with a renewed intensity. "A man who prides himself on being a universal donor. It's possible, but it's sloppy. And David Hayes is not sloppy." She leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "What if the sample he submitted to Thorne's lab wasn't his?" The implication hung in the air. Had he gotten someone else to submit a DNA sample for him, it was a possibility. It would be a bold criminal act of fraud upon the court. But the first test... Alice argued, her mind struggling to keep up. "The one we ordered. It came back positive. He submitted a sample for that one, too. Why would he give a real sample to us and a fake one to his own lawyer's lab?" "Maybe he didn't know which lab was which," Ms. Finch mused. "Maybe he thought our test was the court-ordered one and panicked. It doesn't quite add up. It's a contradiction." For the next few days, Ms. Finch was consumed by this discrepancy. The blood type anomaly was a loose thread, and she was determined to pull it until the entire tapestry of David's deception unraveled. She made a call to a trusted contact, a former medical examiner turned private investigator, and tasked him with a discreet but deep dive into David Hayes's entire medical history. Meanwhile, Ms. Finch decided on a new high-risk legal strategy. She would petition the court for something more than the standard second test. A simple repeat of the test might just yield the same confusing results if there's something more complex going on, she explained to Alice. "We need to argue that given the blood type discrepancy and the conflicting results, we require a more comprehensive form of genetic testing. We need an expert to oversee it." It was a long shot. They would be asking the judge, who was already losing patience, to approve a more expensive, time-consuming process based on what could be dismissed as a simple clerical error. Thorne would paint them as desperate and delusional, throwing Hail Marys to delay the inevitable. They were back in Judge Harrison's chambers a week later. The atmosphere was tense. Thorne immediately went on the attack, accusing Ms. Finch of desperate legal theatrics and abusing the court's time and patience. Ms. Finch remained unruffled. She calmly laid out the evidence. Your Honor, we are not disputing the integrity of the labs. We are questioning the integrity of the samples. We have a medical form signed by Mr. Hayes himself, stating his blood type is O negative. The DNA sample he provided to the petitioner's chosen lab identifies the donor as AB positive. This is a fundamental biological contradiction. It suggests either a mistake of an almost impossible magnitude or, more troublingly, potential fraud. Thorne scoffed. A mistake on a 2-year-old form, Your Honor. That is the crack in the case. It's absurd. But Judge Harrison was listening. He was a stickler for detail, and the contradiction, however small, clearly bothered him. What are you proposing, Ms. Finch? The judge asked, his voice weary but curious. We propose that the court appoint a neutral third-party geneticist to oversee the next sample collection and analysis, she stated clearly. Not just a standard paternity test, but a full genetic sequencing and comparison if necessary to resolve these discrepancies once and for all. We need an expert who can explain to this court why 2 tests could yield 2 different results. We believe the truth is in the science, Your Honor, and we are simply asking for the right scientist to find it. There was a long silence as Judge Harrison considered the request. Alice held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. This was it. If he said no, their fight was over. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, turning to David's lawyer, your client wants the truth. Ms. Finch is proposing a method to find it definitively. Do you have an objection to ensuring the utmost scientific rigor is applied? Thorne was cornered. To object would make his client look like he had something to hide. He exchanged a quick, tense glance with David. Victoria, sitting just behind the bar this time, gave a barely perceptible shake of her head, her confident facade showing its first hairline crack. No, Your Honor, Thorne said through gritted teeth. We have no objection. My client is confident in the truth and welcomes any and all scrutiny. Judge Harrison nodded. Very well. The motion is granted. I will appoint Dr. Miles Bennett, head of medical genetics at Johns Hopkins, to oversee the process. His findings will be presented to this court, and they will be considered final. We will all get to the bottom of this. As they left the chambers, Alice felt a fragile, unfamiliar feeling rise within her, a glimmer of hope. They had their expert. They had their fighting chance. Ms. Finch had found the crack, and now they were about to bring in a sledgehammer. She still didn't understand what was happening, or what David's game was, but for the first time she felt they were no longer playing on his field. They were about to change the rules of the game entirely. Dr. Miles Bennett was a man who seemed to exist in a world of quiet, intellectual certainty. He had kind eyes, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and an air of academic calm that was instantly reassuring. He met with Alice and Ms. Finch in a small private conference room at the courthouse, his presence a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing they had grown accustomed to. He spoke not in legal jargon, but in the precise, fascinating language of genetics. This is a most unusual case, he began after reviewing the file containing the 2 contradictory DNA reports and the fertility clinic records. 2 top-tier labs using the same industry-standard STR marker analysis on samples supposedly from the same 2 people yielding results that are polar opposites. It's a statistical unicorn. He first addressed the most obvious theory. Sample fraud is, of course, a possibility, Dr. Bennett said, looking at Alice with empathy. It's not unheard of for an individual to have someone else submit a sample on their behalf. The blood type discrepancy between the clinic form and the second lab report certainly points a finger in that direction. So David had someone with AB-positive blood submit a sample for him, Ms. Finch summarized. But that still doesn't explain our first test, the test that showed he was the father. He must have given his own sample for that one. Precisely, Dr. Bennett agreed. Why would a man intent on fraud provide one legitimate sample and one fraudulent one? It's illogical. It suggests a lack of a coherent plan which seems out of character for the man described in these files. He tented his fingers, his gaze distant. So we must consider a less common but scientifically plausible alternative. We must entertain this possibility that both lab reports are in their own way correct. Alice and Ms. Finch exchanged a look of bewilderment. How can they both be correct? Alice asked. One says he is the father and one says he isn't. Let's go back to the beginning, Dr. Bennett said, gently turning his attention to Alice. Tell me about your IVF journey. Everything you can remember. Alice recounted the painful, hopeful process, the hormone injections, the egg retrieval, and the embryo transfer. She described the clinic, the doctors, and David's role. He had been supportive, she recalled, but also strangely detached at times. She had chalked it up to his discomfort with medical procedures. He provided his sample at the clinic for the fertilization, Alice confirmed. I was there. He went into a room and he came out. It was his. Dr. Bennett leaned forward, his focus intense. And the samples for the 2 paternity tests. The first one for GenTrack was a cheek swab he did at home and mailed in correct. Yes, Ms. Finch confirmed. And the second one for the Charleston Forensics Lab was also a cheek swab administered at their facility. Correct. And the blood type discrepancy, Dr. Bennett murmured almost to himself. O negative on a form from years ago, AB positive from the recent cheek swab. He paused, looking directly at Alice. Mrs. Hayes, has your husband ever had a major medical procedure, a blood transfusion, an organ transplant, specifically a bone marrow transplant? Alice searched her memory. No, nothing like that. He's always been very healthy. He broke his leg skiing once years ago. That's it. Dr. Bennett stood up and began to pace the small room, his mind clearly working through a complex puzzle. There is a rare biological condition, he began, known as chimerism. He explained it in clear, simple terms. A chimera is an organism that contains cells from 2 or more different individuals, meaning they have 2 sets of DNA. It can happen in a few ways, most commonly when a woman is pregnant with fraternal twins, and one embryo perishes very early on, and its cells are absorbed by the surviving twin. That surviving person can then carry 2 distinct cell lines and 2 distinct DNA profiles for the rest of their life. So, he continued, it is theoretically possible for a man to have one DNA profile in his blood and saliva, the cells that would come from a cheek swab, and a completely different DNA profile in other tissues, including his reproductive organs. The room fell silent as the implication of his words settled. You're saying, Ms. Finch began slowly, her eyes wide with understanding, that the DNA in David's saliva could be from his absorbed twin, making it seem like he's not the father, while his reproductive cells carry his own original DNA, which he passed on to his child, Dr. Bennett finished. The IVF procedure used the sperm cells which would carry the correct paternal DNA. The cheek swabs used for the paternity tests used his saliva cells, which would carry the other DNA. It would explain everything. It was a staggering concept, something from a science fiction novel, yet Dr. Bennett presented it as a simple, if rare, biological fact. The cheek swab tests would truthfully report that the DNA profile they analyzed is not a match to the child, Dr. Bennett elaborated. They wouldn't be wrong. They would just be testing the wrong part of him. The blood type discrepancy also fits. His O-negative blood type could be his primary one, the one on his medical records, while his saliva and other tissues could carry the AB-positive profile from the secondary cell line. Alice felt a wave of dizziness. It was all so complex, so bizarre, and yet it made a terrifying kind of sense. It was the only theory that accounted for every contradictory piece of evidence. David wasn't just a liar, his own body was a lie. But a crucial question remained. "Does David know about this?" Alice asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Could he have this condition and not be aware of it?" "It's possible," Dr. Bennett conceded. "Many chimeras live their entire lives without knowing. The condition is often only discovered by accident through exactly this kind of paternity dispute or pre-transplant testing." "But it doesn't feel like an accident," Ms. Finch said, her voice hard as steel. Victoria's confidence in that courtroom, David's cold certainty. They knew that second test would come back negative. They were counting on it. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of deception so profound it was almost psychopathic. David must have discovered his chimerism at some point, maybe during an early medical screening for the IVF process itself that he had hidden from her. He knew a standard paternity test from a cheek swab would prove he wasn't the father. It was the perfect weapon. A scientifically backed lie. He could let Alice get pregnant via IVF, knowing he had a biological escape hatch all along. He had given his real sample for their private test, likely in a moment of panic or confusion, not realizing its purpose, leading to the 99.9% match. But when his lawyer arranged for the second test, the one they planned to use as their bombshell in court, he knew exactly what to do. He provided the cheek swab, confident the result would be 0. He and Victoria hadn't just anticipated the negative result. They had engineered the entire situation around it. Victoria's laughter in the courtroom wasn't just smugness. It was the giddy triumph of a plan perfectly executed. "He used his own biology to frame me," Alice said, the horror of it washing over her. "Yes," Dr. Bennett said softly. "It appears he did." "So how do we prove it?" Ms. Finch asked, her legal mind already racing ahead. "What's the definitive test?" "We can't use his saliva or his blood," Dr. Bennett explained. "We need to test tissue that is likely to only contain his primary cell line. A skin biopsy would work, or more simply, we can test his parents if they are available. Their DNA would show they are the grandparents of your child, which would by extension prove that their son is the father, regardless of what his cheek swab says. But the most direct route, we test the source. We need a new sample from Mr. Hayes, but not a cheek swab. We need the same kind of sample he provided to the fertility clinic." The room was quiet for a moment. "We need a court-ordered semen sample," Ms. Finch stated, the words hanging in the air. It was an unprecedented, deeply invasive request. But it was the only way to expose the truth that was hiding in David's own cells. Alice felt a cold resolve settle over her. The fight was no longer just about child support or her reputation. It was about revealing a deception so monstrous, so fundamentally twisted, that it had to be brought into the light. David Hayes had used science as his shield. Now they would use it as their sword. The final court hearing felt like the world premiere of a play for which only Alice's side knew the shocking final act. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Robert Thorne and David Hayes sat at their table, exuding an air of weary confidence, as if they were there to finalize an already won battle. Victoria Vance was back seated in the front row of the gallery, her posture perfect, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She looked like a queen surveying her victory. Judge Harrison entered his face an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality. "We are here to hear the findings of the court-appointed expert, Dr. Miles Bennett, regarding the paternity of the child of Mrs. Hayes. Dr. Bennett, you may proceed." Dr. Bennett walked to the witness stand carrying a single thin file. He was sworn in and began to speak, his voice calm and authoritative, a lecturer addressing a captivated class. He started by validating both of the previous DNA reports. "Your Honor," he began, "my investigation concludes that neither Gentrack Diagnostics nor the Charleston Forensics Laboratory made an error. Based on the samples they were given, standard buccal swabs, their conclusions were scientifically sound. Gentrack received a sample that was a 99.999% match. Charleston Forensics received a sample that was a 0% match." Robert Thorne leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. This was going exactly as he'd planned. "However," Dr. Bennett continued, "the discrepancy is not due to lab error or sample tampering in the conventional sense. It is due to a rare biological condition possessed by Mr. David Hayes. Mr. Hayes is a tetragametic chimera." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "In English, please, Doctor." "Certainly, Your Honor." Dr. Bennett then gave the same clear, concise explanation he had given to Alice and Ms. Finch. He explained how a person could carry two distinct sets of DNA. He used simple analogies, speaking of two separate instruction manuals existing within one person. Mr. Hayes's saliva and some of his other tissues, including the sample he provided for the second test, carry the DNA of a fraternal twin brother who was absorbed in the womb. His reproductive cells, however, carry his own distinct DNA profile. Thorne was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculative science fiction. There is no proof of this fantastical condition." "On the contrary, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Bennett said calmly, before the judge could even rule, "there is definitive proof." Ms. Finch stood. "Your Honor, pursuant to Dr. Bennett's recommendation, we filed a motion to compel Mr. Hayes to provide a sample identical in nature to the one he provided for the successful IVF treatment. You granted that motion last week under seal." David's face went pale. He shot a panicked look at Thorne, who seemed genuinely caught off guard. Victoria's smile faltered for the first time. "A new sample was collected from Mr. Hayes by Dr. Bennett himself," Ms. Finch continued. "That sample was analyzed, and its DNA was compared to that of the unborn child." Dr. Bennett opened his file. "The DNA from Mr. Hayes's germline cells, his sperm is a completely different profile from the DNA in his saliva. And the germline DNA is a 99.999% match to the fetus. David Hayes is with absolute scientific certainty the biological father of Mrs. Hayes's child." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was as if the world had stopped spinning. Then chaos. Thorne began sputtering objections, calling the entire proceeding a circus and an invasion of his client's privacy. But the damage was done. The lie, so carefully constructed, so audacious in its scope, had been shattered by a truth even stranger than fiction. Judge Harrison stared at David, a look of profound disgust on his face. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice dangerously low, "did you have prior knowledge of this condition?" David, cornered and exposed, seemed to shrink in his chair. He stammered, I don't. It's a medical thing I didn't understand." But Ms. Finch was not finished. "We have more, Your Honor." She produced another document. "This is a record from a preliminary genetic screening Mr. Hayes underwent a year and a half ago at a private clinic in Atlanta, 6 months before the IVF process began. He told my client it was for a life insurance policy. This report clearly identifies his chimerism. It explicitly warns that standard paternity tests using blood or saliva would likely yield a negative result. He knew. He has known all along." The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. This was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a premeditated, calculated fraud. He had knowingly entered into the IVF process with his wife, all while holding a get-out-of-jail-free card, a biological trump card he planned to play to abandon her and their child. Victoria Vance looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face was a mask of utter shock and horror. The plan which she had thought was so clever was not just a failure. It was a public spectacle of their own monstrous deception. The smug laughter she had directed at Alice now seemed like a grotesque prelude to her own downfall. She stared at David not with love or support, but with the dawning, furious realization that his web of lies was far more complex than she had ever imagined, and she was now caught in it with him. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Thorne, I suggest you sit down before I hold you both in contempt. Of all the cynical, manipulative, and cruel tactics I have seen in my 20 years on this bench, this is by far the most reprehensible. To use one's own unique biology as a tool for such a profound and calculated deceit against one's wife and unborn child is beyond the pale." He looked at the evidence, then at Alice, his expression softening for the first time into one of deep respect and sympathy. "The court finds the expert testimony of Dr. Bennett to be conclusive," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "Paternity is established. Mr. David Hayes is the legal and biological father. All motions by the petitioner are dismissed. I will be ruling in favor of Mrs. Hayes on all matters of support, and I can assure you, Ms. Finch, I will be taking Mr. Hayes's egregious conduct into severe consideration when determining the final settlement. His attempt to commit fraud upon this court will be dealt with separately and with the appropriate gravity." He banged the gavel one last time. "This hearing is adjourned." It was over. Alice sat stunned, the wave of vindication so powerful it left her breathless. Ms. Finch squeezed her hand, her own eyes shining with triumph. Across the room, David Hayes sat with his head in his hands, a broken man, his intricate deception dismantled piece by piece in front of the world. Victoria stood up abruptly and walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance, her face a mask of cold fury. The partnership, it seemed, was dissolved. Alice had walked into the legal battle armed with a simple truth. She had been met with a lie so complex it was woven into her husband's very DNA. But in the end, the full, unvarnished, and bizarre truth had come out, and it had set her free. The aftermath of the verdict was swift and brutal for David Hayes. The court awarded Alice a settlement that reflected the depth of his deception, giving her the house significant support and financial security. His attempt to commit fraud led to a criminal investigation, and the public scandal cost him his career and his partnership with Victoria, which dissolved into bitter accusations. The empire he and his mistress had planned was now rubble, and he became a pariah in the city he once commanded. For Alice, victory tasted of peace. She reclaimed her home and her life, finding strength in her hard-won independence. A few weeks later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, naming him Ethan, a name that meant strong. Holding him for the first time, she felt a love so fierce it erased the shadows of the past. Her life found a new, quiet rhythm, filled with the simple joys of motherhood and a slow return to her own career. David was a footnote in her story now. No longer a prisoner in a gilded cage, Alice was a free woman, embracing a new dawn she had won for herself and her son. Alice's story is a powerful reminder that the fight for truth is often a fight for one's own sanity. It wasn't just about a courtroom battle. It was about reclaiming her narrative from the gaslighting and profound deceit of the two people she should have been able to trust the most. She faced public humiliation and impossible odds, armed with nothing but a mother's instinct and the courage to demand answers when the science itself seemed to lie. Her victory was not just legal, but personal, a reclamation of her dignity and her strength. The incredible twist of genetic chimerism shows that sometimes reality is far stranger and more complex than any fiction. What do you think you would have done in her position? Could you have been as resilient as Alice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If her incredible story of courage and resilience moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to see the power of perseverance, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories that prove the truth is always worth fighting for.